Hey, how's it going? Welcome to or welcome back to my channel. I'm Elissa. Today we're going to be going over all of the books that I read in February. February was an interesting reading month for me. I really wanted to continue with the momentum from my excellent reading month that I had back in January, and it sort of continued, but not really. I ended up reading a total of 14 books, which is amazing. And even though I did read a few incredible books this month, I also feel like I had a lot of misses. So starting off with my stats, I read a total of 14 books. That amounts to about 4,704 pages, give or take, as I did listen to a lot of these books through audio. Now, in terms of the moods that I read, this tends to be a pretty consistent category for me. I read books that are emotional, dark, challenging, mysterious, and reflective. That tends to be the case on this channel. We read a lot of dark fiction, a lot of slow reflective books, but as you know, I try to push myself out of my comfort zone quite often, so there are a bunch of random books that I read every single month. So in terms of pace, it looks like about 92% of the books that I read this month were medium paced, with the other 8% being slow paced books. So I didn't really read anything that was super action packed or super plot driven this month. In terms of page count, 7% of the books that I read, which amounts to one book, was over 500 pages. About 43% of the books that I read were under 300 pages, and about 50% of the books that I read were between 300 and 500 pages. I'm really proud of this next category. I do have a yearly challenge going on where I want to read at least one nonfiction book a month. I did fall behind in January. I don't think I read one single nonfiction book, but that's fine because I caught up this month. Now, in terms of genre, it looks like my most read genre this month was horror with 4 books. Then after that, literary fiction with 3 books. So out of the 14 books that I read, 4 of them were 5-star reads. So we still had some solid good reads this month. Unfortunately, out of all of the books that I read, only one of them came from my physical TBR, and I actually ended up adding an extra book to my TBR because I did purchase one of the books that I read because I loved it so much. Now, out of the 14 books that I read, 8 of them came from the library, and 5 of them were advanced reader copies through NetGalley. Now, in terms of format, 7 of them I read through audiobook, 3 of them I read as ebooks, and 4 of them I read as physical books. So out of the 14 books that I read this month, 13 of them were written by women. One of them was a collection of letters and or essays, and it was edited by 2 separate authors, and it was a collaboration between multiple authors, so I didn't know how to categorize that, so I just counted 13 of the books. One book that I read was translated from Spanish to English. 3 of the books that I read were written by Latinx authors. 3 of them were also written by Black authors, and 11 of the books that I read were from new to me authors. Now, in terms of publication dates, the oldest book that I read this month was from 2019, and it was one of my nonfiction books, The 7 Necessary Sins for Women and Girls by Mona Eltahaway. And I did start A Clash of Kings by George R.R. Martin, but I didn't finish it in February. I'm set to finish it within the first couple days of March, but if not, that would have been my oldest book so far. Now, in terms of the newest book that I read, there were several. I did read a couple of advanced reader copies, so I'll talk about those more later on in the video. The longest book that I read was Our Share of Night by Mariana Enriquez, and this book is 608 pages long. It's also the one translated book that I read, and unfortunately, I didn't finish any series or start any series this month. So with that, we can get into the books. I'll go ahead and start off with the one book that I did DNF this month. And I think this month I want to talk to you about the books in my level of enjoyment. So I'll start off talking about the books that I enjoyed the least and then end with the books that I enjoyed the most. That way we end on a happy note. The only book that I did DNF in the month of February is Killers of a Certain Age. This is by Deanna Raybourn. And the reason that I picked up this book is because I'm looking for other mystery books that have that feel of the Finlay Donovan series, where there is a mystery, but there's also all of these other ludicrous things going on, something that is over the top and funny. But unfortunately, this one didn't work out for me. So I actually didn't get very far into this book. I DNF'd it before I finished chapter 1, but from what I can gather, we're following a group of women who belong to this network of assassins, and they've worked here for about 40 years. Now, as they're getting older, they're not as appreciated because there's more focus on technology rather than on people building skills. And so they decide to retire, and they book a cruise to go ahead and celebrate that retirement. But they find out that someone from this company that they used to work for is now trying to murder them. And that sounds like such a great concept, but I don't know what it was about the book. Maybe I just wasn't in the mood for it. I did try to listen to the audiobook and I just wasn't engaged. It wasn't keeping my attention. I found the characters to be a little bit flat. And granted, I only read about a chapter of this book, right? So it's one that I might revisit later on in the year, depending on how I'm feeling. But if you have any recommendations for me, let me know because I am on the hunt for something similar to Finley Donovan. The next book on this list is called Hysterical, a Memoir, and this is by Elissa Bassist. Hysterical was such a big disappointment for me because I expected to fully enjoy this book and love it. So in this one, we are following the author where she recounts moments in her life where she sought help from the medical community and was largely dismissed. Now, this is an extremely important topic because there are times where women are completely dismissed or not believed or labeled as hysterical when they come to the doctor for some unexplained pain. And I really wanted this book to work for me just for that fact alone. And I think what didn't work for me with this book is that Elissa Bassist tried to do a lot with this book without really having the writing skills to achieve it. It was part memoir, so we are learning about different points in her life, but then she also does a really good job at including research to back up her claims. However, the way that she incorporated this research was done in a very clunky way. It was very dry, and she would include entire passages from other books that she's read, some of which I've actually read myself, which prompted me to want to go back and reread that specific book. Or in the case where she mentioned books that I haven't read, it made me want to go read that particular book instead. So overall, she just didn't blend the elements of the book very well. Another thing to note is that she does embed her own humor into the book. Humor is very subjective. In this case, it didn't work for me, so unfortunately, I gave it a 2 stars. The next book on this list is a book that I actually didn't rate. If you follow me on Goodreads, you already probably saw my review. I didn't give it a star rating, and that's because I didn't want the star rating to detract from the importance of this book. There were just certain triggers for me specifically that made my enjoyment of this book just plummet, and once I encountered those moments in the book, I didn't really enjoy my reading experience whatsoever. But if I had rated it, it would have been a 2 star. And that is Tell Me I'm Worthless by Alison Rumfitt. In it, we are following 2 separate women, Alice and Illa. Now, in the past, Alice and Illa were really close friends and lovers at some point. They had a third friend named Hannah who completed their trio. And one day they decide to go into this haunted house, and Hannah never made it out. Now, Alice and Illa, several years later, are still being haunted by the events of what occurred that night, and both of them have really different interpretations of what happened that night. Now, this particular moment in time, the day that they survived that haunted house, catapulted them to who they are in the present and the choices that they've made. So Alice is a trans woman, and we really get a depiction of her trying to just survive through all of the trauma that she's gone through. Alice finds herself going through this rabbit hole and making a bunch of bad decisions. On the other hand, we have Illa, who is both a queer woman and also a person of color who has become a TERF from the events that transpired in that haunted house. So in a way, she's trying to reconcile how she felt for Alice when they spent that time together, and right now when she's actively opposing trans women's rights. So it's a really interesting book that has a lot of powerful things to say. It is a book that is pushing back against fascism. Just some of the triggers in it didn't work for me, and that just brought my level of enjoyment down. So do look up trigger warnings before going in. Okay, so now we're going to talk about my 3-star reads. I have 2 of those. The first one of those is The 7 Necessary Sins for Women and Girls. This is by Mona Eltahaway, and this is a work of nonfiction. And I would say this is a feminist manifesto. This is Mona Eltahaway's call to action. She is compelling women and girls to access their anger and their autonomy to fight for feminist rights. In particular, she talks about the 7 necessary sins, which include attention, anger, ambition, power, violence, and lust, and she encourages women to not shy away from these things and instead to harness them. Now, there are a couple of things that I really enjoyed about this book. The first is that she does take a more global feminist approach. I feel like a lot of the feminist works that I read tend to be very Western and US centric, and Mona Eltahaway really includes a variety of different perspectives. Another thing that I really like is that she is so unapologetic in her call to action. I did listen to this book through audiobook, and she narrates it herself, and you could just feel and hear the fervor and the passion that she has for this. So I really, really appreciated that. I will say that I had some difficulty getting through this book. At some points in time, it felt like a slog. Even though these are important topics that she was talking about, there was just so much repetition. And maybe that was supposed to act as a way to enforce her message, but unfortunately, all it did was weigh it down. So I would sit there listening to several chapters, and it felt like I had already read it. So at some point, it just became very boring. And I do wonder if I would have enjoyed it more if I was newer to reading feminist works. So this might be a very good introduction for people who want to read more about feminism, but from more of a global perspective. The next book on this list I also gave 3 stars to. This is The Raven Thief by Gigi Pandian. And this is going to be a new release for March. It does come out March 21st. Now, this is the sequel to the Secret Staircase mystery series. At first, I thought they were companion novels. However, you will want to read this after the first one, which is Under Lock and Skeleton Key. And the reason for that is because we actually do have an overall mystery going on that involves our main character Tempest and a potential family curse. And that mystery is being solved and uncovered as the series goes on. Now, The Raven Thief on its own has its own locked room mystery that you have to solve. And we're following our main character Tempest Raj, who is now working for her father's company called Secret Staircase Construction Company, where they design and build custom rooms that have secret passages and hidden drawers, and it's just honestly so fun to read about. In this book in particular, we're following Tempest as she becomes a sleuth detective trying to solve this locked room mystery with 4 impossibilities. She and her grandpa attended the seance of a recent customer where her ex-husband ends up dead, and Tempest's grandpa quickly becomes a person of interest. So it's up to Tempest to clear not only her grandpa, but her family name. Now, I found The Raven Thief to be particularly fun, cozy, and creative. I was intrigued both by the locked room mystery that was going on within this particular book, but also to the overall development of the bigger mystery that we're solving. Now, I did find The Raven Thief to be a tad bit too long. At some point, I found myself looking at all of the chapters that I still had left, wondering when the book would end. There were a couple of times where it felt like not every scene was necessary. Another thing that didn't quite work for me as well for this particular book, which in reality is not the fault of this book because it is a cozy mystery book, but I did feel like it lacked a little bit of tension and weight. Tempest's grandpa has been arrested for the murder of someone, and it didn't feel serious at the time. Those are my only 2 complaints about this book. I still very much enjoyed the writing. I always have a good time reading Gigi Pandian's works, and I will continue to read on in the series. The next book that I ended up reading is called The Many Dates of Indigo. This is by Amber D. Samuel, and this is actually a recent release. It was released back in December of 2022, and this is a friends to lovers second chance romance. I did give it 3.5 stars. In this book, we are following Indigo, who is a smart and ambitious woman who has this thriving shoe store. She seems to have everything in her life figured out, or almost everything in her life figured out. The only thing she seems to not be able to pin down is a healthy relationship. And as she's approaching her 30th birthday and also becoming a bridesmaid for the people around her, she starts to feel like there's something missing. She has an immense amount of success, but she doesn't really have someone to share it with. So Indigo starts to casually date in the hopes to find the right man. Now, as Indigo begins two casual relationships and she goes on dates with these two very different guys, we also get a glimpse into her relationship with her best friend Tate. We know right off the bat that Indigo and Tate had some romantic relationship at some point in their life. For whatever reason, it didn't work out and they decided to remain friends. However, it is very obvious that Indigo and Tate are very much into each other, but neither of them is making a move. So what I really enjoyed about this book were the honest and raw conversations that Amber Samuel included in this book. One of the people that Indigo starts to date is suffering with alcoholism, and so she and that person end up having a very real and honest conversation about what that means for the relationship moving forward, which is super important. And with the other person Indigo is dating, she's having real conversation about the life that she wants moving forward, if she wants kids, what her career is going to look like, what type of partner she wants, which again, I think are super important conversations to have. Now, in terms of the actual romance part, there was one particular guy that I couldn't stand, to be honest, but a lot of the dynamics between Indigo and the three separate people were really cute, really fun, and very unique in their own way. I especially, of course, love the relationship between Indigo and Tate. You can definitely tell that they're best friends, that they know each other, and that they really care about each other. Overall, I thought it was a very fun romance that didn't shy away from having difficult conversations. And I'd say the spicy level was about a 3 out of 10. The next book that I read was Jackal by Erin E. Adams, and I also gave this book 3.5 stars. This is a horror mystery book, and it's actually the debut novel for this author. So in it, we're following our main character, Liz. She grew up in this very small racist town in Pennsylvania, I believe, and she made it out. She's no longer living there. And although Liz doesn't have very fond memories of this place that she grew up, when her best friend is getting married, she decides to attend the wedding. Now, we learn over the course of the story that in this particular town, Black girls go missing, and they've been going missing now for quite some generations. Liz herself had an encounter when she was little where she was almost snatched, and this is something that she's had to live with and reckon with, and something that still haunts her. Now, in the present, Liz's best friend's daughter, Caroline, goes missing. And Liz decides that even though she was only going to stay for a few days, she has to stay and see this through until Caroline is found. And as she begins to dig more into the history of the town and into the disappearances of other Black girls, she starts to uncover secrets and see some similarities between the disappearances. Jackal is going to be a recommendation for people who really love Stephen King books. Not only do you have this small town that is rich with history, you also have a strong cast of characters and an absolutely gorgeous atmosphere. The atmosphere in this book was immaculate. Adams does such a great job at capturing a forest, the denseness of it, the expansiveness of it, but also making it feel claustrophobic. There's one particular scene that I can't get out of my mind, and it's when our main character gets lost in the forest and she just keeps running circles over and over and over and over again. As a hiker, that is like one of my biggest fears, so I thought she did that very, very well. She also does a great job at, again, creating the history of this town and of these characters, and also at creating tension between different groups of people. If you're someone that also loves social horror, I think that this might be a really good book for you to pick up because Adams does introduce some social commentary on who people deem worthy of investigating. In this particular scenario, we have a Black girl who has a white mother. Therefore, there's a larger magnifying glass on this particular case, and that's juxtaposed with the several other Black girls that have gone missing who don't have white parents or don't have rich parents. What I will say is that I did listen to this book via audio, and that confused me a little bit at the beginning. Now we follow Liz, but we also get chapters from the girls that have gone missing and also chapters from the perpetrator. And they sort of just mix together in my head. I do wish that I would have picked up either an ebook or the physical copy of the book because I was very confused right at the beginning of the book. Next couple of reads are going to be the 4-star books that I read in the month of February, starting off with my 4-star reads. The first one of those is the Faraway World Stories, and this is by Patricia Engel. This was yet another new release. It was published back in January of 2023. Now, I actually own this author's debut novel. I believe it's called Infinite Country. And for whatever reason, I never got to it, even though it was a book that I was really excited about. But after reading this short story collection from her, I really want to prioritize reading that particular book this year because I just really fell in love with this collection of short stories. So, The Faraway World is an anthology containing 10 previously published short stories, and this is a bind up of them together. These 10 short stories are very character focused and they capture a variety of different experiences across the Latinx diaspora. These stories focus on people living on the fringes of life, characters that you wouldn't normally find at the center of a novel, and she gives them a voice, she explores their humanity, and she talks about the most mundane, quotidian things from day to day life, but she does it in such a remarkable way that these characters are bleeding with life. The only reason I didn't give this short story collection 5 stars is because not every short story felt complete. Some of them just sort of ended abruptly, but gosh, every single short story made me feel like I was learning about a real person, and I really enjoyed that. The next book that I ended up giving 4 stars to in the month of February is The God of Endings by Jacqueline Holland, and this is a book that I did get an ARC for through NetGalley. This will be published March 7 of 2023. I'm not exactly sure when this video is coming up, so by the time you're watching this, it might have already been published. So this is a book that crept up on me unexpectedly. When I first started reading it, I didn't think I was going to enjoy it as much as I did. This is this author's debut novel, and it's akin to The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, except it doesn't focus on romance. Instead, it focuses on this woman's inability to sort of accept that she's an immortal and to come to terms with it. She has a lot of questions about permanence and about whether she deserves this kind of life. I would say it's a mix of literary and historical fiction with a sprinkle, a dab of horror. And so we are following a reluctant immortal named Anna in dual perspectives. We follow her in the present day where she teaches American kids who are in kindergarten or preschool. I can't really remember. In this timeline, we get a sense of who Anna has become. She is very detached from most people in her life. Now, she slowly becomes to get involved in the life of this kid who is a very gifted artist at a very young age. Now, as she becomes more entangled in this kid's life, she also starts to unravel more. She feels like someone's following her. Now, in the other timeline, we're learning about Anna's past and how she became to be an immortal, how she came to America, how she became a teacher. Can't really pinpoint exactly what worked for this book, other than I just really enjoyed the atmosphere. At some points, I would put the book down because it is a very slow moving book. And then I'd find myself drawn back to it, wanting to find out what happened. If you're someone who goes into this book thinking it's going to be gory and scary, there's some suspense that is built throughout the book and some violence that is definitely present, but it is quite sparse. I think this book actually has a lot more gothic vibes than horror vibes. So I think if you're someone who really likes to learn about one individual figure and you like historical fiction, but you want something that has a little bit of suspense, a little bit of lore, a little bit of vampire, this might be one to check out because you might like it. The next 2 books on this list are my 4.5 star reads. The first one of those is Our Wives Under the Sea. This is by Julia Armfield. This is a book that I couldn't quite pin down how I felt about it immediately after I finished reading it, but it's one that has been on my mind quite often ever since then. It's also one that is a little bit challenging for me to talk about because I think it's one where, depending on the reader and depending what mindset you're in, you could have different interpretations of what this book is. To me, it felt like a slow moving, very reflective, speculative fiction novel. It's told in alternating voices. The first narrative that we follow is Leah's, and we learn about Leah's perspective and Leah's journey through a journal that she kept while she went on this explorative sea dive expedition that went wrong. It was only supposed to take a couple of weeks, and Leah and 2 of her other co-workers got stuck for 6 months in a submarine somewhere deep, deep, deep in the ocean without any light, without any communication to the surface. And while they were down there, not everything made sense and some weird things started to happen. Now the onion is peeled back throughout the book as we start to learn more about Leah as we get further into her journal. Now the other perspective is through Mary, who is Leah's partner. Mary was in a place where she was grieving Leah's absence, and now that Leah is back, seems like Mary is still grieving the loss of her partner. It turns out that Leah isn't quite the same person that she was before she left on that expedition. She is stuffing paper towels into her gums, she is bleeding from random places, and she seems to spend a lot of time in the bathtub. And that's really all that I want to tell you about the plot of this book. The writing of the book is also really interesting because at times the writing was very beautiful and lyrical, and there were passages that I just wanted to highlight and tattoo all over my body. And then other parts, especially the parts through Leah's perspective, are very scientific and it almost feels like you're reading a textbook. So that was interesting how those two things clashed in the book, but they clashed in a very beautiful way as well. I didn't think it detracted from the book. If anything, it just gave a stronger narrative voice to each of the characters in the book. It's a book that I already want to reread, and I'll definitely be reading more books by Julia Armfield. So the next book that I gave 4.5 stars to is Our Share of Night by Mariana Enriquez. This is the only translated work that I read in the month of February, and it's the book that I immediately bought after reading the ARC that was provided to me by NetGalley. I love this book so much and I just needed to have it on my shelves. Mariana Enriquez is an Argentinian author, and two of her previous short story collections were translated into English. The first one is The Things We Lost in the Fire, and the second one is The Dangers of Smoking in Bed. For any of you that have read either of those story collections, you will already have an idea of the tone and brutality of this book. Mariana Enriquez does not shy away from the brutality and the bleakness of the world around us, and that's definitely interwoven and very present in this book. If anything, with Our Share of Night, Mariana Enriquez dives further into the occult, into violence, and to the erotic world around us. I would say that Our Share of Night is definitely a genre-bending epic. I don't know if you can tell the size of this, but it is a hefty one. And it's just a book that has so many different aspects to it while equally being immersive and compelling. So this book is set in the decades during and after the Argentinian military dictatorship. And there's a lot of history that is actually interwoven between the pages of this book. The atrocities and the violence that was committed during that time period is definitely present in here, along with mythology of indigenous tribes of this region, and particularly of the Guarani people of Paraguay. This novel definitely leans into its darker elements. You have dark fantasy present, you have cosmic horror present, there's also elements of a haunted house story in here. It's a nod equally to Stephen King books and even H.P. Lovecraft, but Mariana Enriquez really makes this her own, and I couldn't look away, I couldn't stop reading, it was so good. And I just realized I haven't told you what this book is about. So in it, we're following a father and a son, Juan and Gaspar. Juan, the father, is a medium for this powerful cult called the Order, who seek immortality, and they'll go to any lengths to keep their power and keep this tradition going. Now, because of the nature of the work that the mediums do, they often don't survive very long. And in order to protect his son from inheriting this legacy, Juan will go to any lengths to shield and to hide his son, even if that means that he has to become a monster himself. There is tons of content warnings for this. It's definitely not for the faint of heart. There is on-page brutality and very graphic scenes, so please do look up content warnings before going in. The next book that I read in the month of February that I gave 5 stars to is a memoir called Finding Me by Viola Davis. And if you decide to pick up this book, please go ahead and pick up the audiobook. Viola Davis narrates it herself, and she does an amazing job. Now, I know that celebrity memoirs can be hit or miss depending on what you're looking for when you read it. So even though Viola Davis does talk about her career in this book, that is not the emphasis of it. She starts to talk more about her career towards the last 30% of the book. Like the titular name suggests, this is a story about Viola and about her growing up and finding herself. It's a memoir about her trials and her tribulations and all of the work that she had to do to find her voice and to come into herself. There was just so much that I learned about Viola Davis, and I'm just in awe of her and of who she is as a person. This memoir made me laugh, it made me cry, it made me reflect on my own life. It was just so well written, and she's an incredible storyteller. Highly recommend. The next book that I gave 5 stars to is another nonfiction book. This is called Letters to a Writer of Color, and it was edited by Deepa Anapara and Tamor Sumro. Now, I am not the intended audience for this book. I'm not a writer, but I am an avid reader and I'm a book reviewer. And what this book did is give me not only insights into the writing process, but it also gave me tools and language that I think will help me be a better book reviewer. So Letters to a Writer of Color is an anthology of, I believe, 10 different essays written by a variety of writers of color. Each essay focuses on a different topic. For example, there's some on humor, there's some on translation, there's another one on characterization, and another one on plot. And what I really liked about this collection of essays is that it really challenged the Western style of writing and its limitations. It's actually a book that helped me realize what books that I'm drawn to, like multi-narrative perspectives or books that play with time or with format. I really enjoyed hearing different perspectives from a variety of different authors, and I hope that it will make me a better book reviewer moving forward. I feel like the more that I enjoy a book, the harder it is for me to articulate why I loved a book so much. Does anybody else feel that way? Anyways, the next book on this list is The Storyteller's Death. This is by Davila Cardinal, and this is a book that just spoke to my soul. What I primarily loved about The Storyteller's Death was the storytelling itself. This is a beautiful tale about family, about grief, and about inheritance and the choices that we make. I'd say that if you liked The Astonishing Color of After or The Inheritance of Orquídea Divina, this is a book that you'll highly enjoy. So in it, we're following our main character, Isla, and after her father dies, her mom starts to send Isla to Puerto Rico with her family every single summer. Here on this island, Isla develops a very strong connection with her aunt, and we also have a very tender and budding friendship with a local boy from the island. When Isla's grandmother dies, she inherits the family gift, which is being able to live out the stories of the cuentistas in her family or the storytellers in her family. And so we do follow Isla trying to make sense of this gift and of these visions and what they mean and how to deal with them. Gosh, it's honestly a book that I just couldn't put down. I was so riveted with the story. It's such a beautifully written book. It has such great storytelling and great characters, and I just can't wait to read more books by Davila. The last and final book that I ended up reading in the month of February is a new release. This is called Liar, Dreamer, Thief, and it is by Maria Dong. And I would say that this was my favorite book that I read in February. This one in particular is one that I have difficulty expressing how much I loved it because it's a really weird book. And at times it feels very chaotic. I would say that my experience reading this book felt like looking through a kaleidoscope. Once I thought I had everything figured out, the story kept shifting and pivoting, and it constantly kept me on my toes. Liar, Dreamer, Thief is part conspiracy thriller, but it's also part mystery sleuth. It's also a book about fractured families and a story about revenge, but it's also a book about being in your 20s and not having your life figured out and making mistakes, about not fitting a certain mold. And because you don't fit that mold, people have different expectations of you. It was just honestly such a beautiful and weird book. And what I think made this book worth it for me was the main character. So let me tell you what this book is about. In it, we're following Katrina. She is a college dropout who has a tendency to retreat into this imagined world that is based on one of her favorite childhood books. And she calls this world her kitchen door world. Anytime something stressful is going on in her life or she becomes anxious, she goes into this kitchen door world as a coping mechanism. Now, Katrina, right off the bat, is not a likable character for most people. She has tons of flaws. She has a shitty relationship with her parents and a shitty relationship with her roommate, and a lot of the conflict in those relationships is her fault. She's not reliable, she has trouble communicating, she's not able to concentrate on tasks, and she has this obsession with one of her coworkers named Kurt. Now we find out that she's been secretly, or maybe not so secretly, stalking her coworker. And one night she sees him jump off a bridge. From there, we follow her trying to unravel this mystery surrounding Kurt's death. It was just such a weird book. But Katrina, apart from having her flaws, is a very tenacious character with tons of curiosity and a big heart. And I think that she will win you over if you give this book a chance. I do want to stress how weird of a book it is. It shifts between third person and second person. In the beginning of it, especially, feels very chaotic because she does retreat into this kitchen door world. So you don't really get a sense of where the plot is going until about 30% in, I would say. So if you don't mind that, I would suggest you give it a try. So those were all of the books that I read in February. Let me know down below how your month went. What was your favorite book? Let's go with the classic. If you made it this far, leave a book emoji down below. Thank you for watching, and I will see you on the next one. Bye.